Making large vehicles in Polybridge has sort of become my thing, and in this video, I wanted to try to make a working jet and a working boat using a very specific glitch that I developed in my last video. But starting out in the sandbox now, the first thing I need to do is recreate the engine that I made and kinda show you how it works. Now you can see for this, I'm basically building up a large wheel out of steel, and on the outside of this, I'm putting down a lot of roads. The purpose of this is it's gonna let me put down a monster truck on the inside, and if I pin this in place using some hydraulics, as it pushes further out, for whatever reason, it tends to just fly into the air. Now, why this works, I'm not entirely sure, but there's a few things about this engine that are interesting. The main thing though is that the engine actually flies in a determined direction, and it seems to always go in the direction of the truck's wheels. This is really important, and you can see now I'm actually trying to simplify the engine a lot more. Now, instead of using the monster truck, I'm just using this compact car, and I'm also only using a few sections of road. I was hoping I could get this as simple as possible, and by doing this, it should make it very easy to stuff into the plane. Now, unfortunately though, it just seems like it doesn't really work as well like this, and without the monster truck, it just really didn't want to fly. So next, for a little bit of extra stability, I was thinking maybe I could link a couple of these together. It is kind of huge, which isn't gonna be great for the plane, but I figured that if I could get this to work with two monster trucks, I might be in better shape. Now, you can see me dropping this down here, and starting out, it's actually not terrible. It seems to bounce into the air a little bit, but overall, the random movements of the trucks here didn't really seem to be that much of an improvement over a single wheel design, and once I settled on just sticking with that basic design here, I wanted to move on to designing the plane's body. Now, to me, since this thing is going to be so sensitive, it seemed like designing the entire body of the plane to start with was gonna be the move here. Once I have all the weight distributed the way that I want, then I can start to fine-tune things and hopefully get this to stay in the air. Now, originally, I was thinking of making this out of steel, but I realized that custom shapes actually were going to be a lot better here, and this is for one big reason. The custom shape is pretty much just as easy to move around, but the big advantage to this is I can actually change how thick the shape is, and therefore I can create some much more interesting designs than just with steel. Now, to start here though, you can see I'm just making the basic body shape that I want, and once I got all the nodes in place here, now you can see I added in a second custom shape, and I'm deleting off a lot of the nodes on the plane. This is so that I can just have it be the tail section, and you can see here I made it a lot thinner. This was what I was talking about having different thicknesses, and by using this, I should be able to create something that's a lot more interesting than just plain steel. Now, to make this look a little more interesting, I added on another custom shape between the tail fin and the body, and you can see here I got this nice little step that makes it look a little more realistic. Now, after I had that, I figured the body would be the next thing I want to work on, and for this, I wanted to create something that sort of looked like a tube. It was going to be a little boxy, but I figured just by moving in some nodes a bit further, now what I could do is intentionally create a cavity in the larger shape and hold a smaller shape inside of it. Now, the effect that this has is it lets me hold on to a much larger shape in the center, and with this, you can see I get a much more interesting body profile. Now, this custom shape thickness thing is actually new to the third game, and honestly, it's incredibly useful for builds like this to make them look a lot better. In fact, here you can see what I'm doing is attaching the tail up to the body and the connector piece, and once I got this in place now, I wanted to work on the wing. Of course, I can make these custom shapes really thick, and by doing that, I can make a pretty realistic looking wing. At first here, it was a little boxier than I wanted, but by using a lot of custom shapes and having them kind of staircase forward, this gives me something that looks a little more realistic. Of course though, the more custom shapes I add in here, the more weight I'm adding, and also the more complexity, which is gonna make the physics engine a little unhappy. And this all looks good, but there is one big problem. You'll notice the plane is significantly smaller than my engine right now, and ideally I wanted to hide the engine inside the plane. This was gonna cause some problems, and to hopefully fix that, I tried reducing the size of this engine down to 50%. This obviously is gonna make it a lot smaller, but I was worried by doing this, it put the nodes too close together, and it might actually break the engine. I didn't have much of a choice though, so I tried it out now, and you can see once I got all these nodes in place, and pretty much the exact same places as before, it did seem to be working. It definitely was a lot less powerful than before, but fortunately it still was able to fly, and with a little bit of tuning here, I was even able to get it to knock the plane into the water. So with these basic mechanics looking pretty good, the next thing I wanted to do here was increase the size of the plane by quite a bit. Now it's easy enough just to scale up all of the custom shapes on this, and by doing that, it's gonna let me hide the engine perfectly in the plane. The other advantage of doing this is that it doesn't actually increase the weight of the plane at all, so it should actually fly just as fast as before. So after a fairly painful session of moving all of these wing segments back into place, the next thing I wanted to do here was control which direction this was flying. Now, like I said before, it'll always fly in the direction of the wheels of the truck, and in order to fine-tune that, I used 4 hydraulics to precisely rotate the truck to get it to fly level. And with these in place here, I was able to start getting some pretty decent flights, and although I was going into the water at first here, with some very slight rotations, I was able to get everything back in a much better state, and now I was able to fly into the air. This was pretty incredible, and you can see here the speed I'm getting on 1x is actually really good. With a lot more tuning here, I was even able to get some very interesting flights, and you can see now I'm able to loop around in the air before landing on the other island. The plane disintegrated a little bit on the other side here, but for how uncontrolled I have this engine right now, I'm surprised how well this is working. Now, to fix the plane from completely disintegrating at the end, I thought about maybe adding in some springs here to help me out with that, but there's a few problems. The first is that if I give the plane the ability to collide with nodes, it ends up breaking the engine, and the other thing is these springs would instantly collapse under the load of that engine because it's just way too powerful to be stopped. Now, I decided to paint this up a little bit here and just clean it up a little bit, but honestly, there was something I wanted to do that was a little more difficult than just this simple plane. Instead of just generating a bunch of thrust sideways and randomly flipping in the air, I wanted to make a precision-controlled vehicle using this engine. This, of course, is going to be a boat, and I knew it was going to be significantly harder than the jet in order to get right. Now, also for additional controllability, one thing I was thinking of doing was having a second engine that faces into the first one. By doing this, I can cancel out a lot of the force on the engine, and this should overall make it a lot less powerful. It also has the advantage of being a lot more controllable though, since now I have a lot more hydraulics I can fine-tune to get the positioning just right. So of course, I copied it over to the other side here, and after that, you can see I used a bunch of steel to hold this all together. Now, I wanted to make sure the chassis was reasonably rigid since it was going to be dealing with a lot of force, and after that, I built up a little foot for this whole thing to sit on. Now, sort of like with the plane, I kind of wanted to build the entire chassis and the design right now, and that's that the weight distribution was going to be tuned just right so I didn't mess it up later once I added on everything else. Once I got everything roughly in place, I wanted to try it out now. There were some problems with this though, and you can see here that my engines weren't really canceling each other out. In this first test here, it wanted to go to the right more than it wanted to go left, and by tuning some stuff around here, it never really got better. It always seemed to jump into the air some random direction, or one of the engines would stall out, and no matter what I did, it was kind of always just a disaster. This was when I decided that having two engines cancel each other out wasn't really gonna work, and it's because the engines are just way too unpredictable. Instead though, I wanted to create a new engine, and you can see I'm going back to my much larger design. This of course produced a lot more thrust, but it also seemed to be a little more predictable in where it was going. Now, once I got the basics of this design made here, you can see I flipped the truck around to instead face directly up, and I'm putting a custom shape on top of that. Now, this custom shape is gonna weigh down the car, and ideally I'll be able to balance out its thrust with that weight and make it stay right in the air. Trying this out though, the weight distribution was a little messed up, and you can see it sort of just flies wherever it wants. So to fix that, I added on some guiding bars here, and this should keep the entire thing rigid. Now, I also wanted to lower the center of mass a little bit on the shape, so to do that, you can see here I'm curling it around the wheel, and while this isn't entirely necessary since it doesn't have collision with it anyway, I think it makes it look a little bit better. And of course, in this first test here, it was way too powerful and was getting launched way up too high. So to fix that, I eventually realized I could lower the the mass of the truck, and that creates less thrust. Now, by fine-tuning this, I was starting to get some results here, and with even more fine-tuning, I was getting some results here that made it seem like I might be able to hover above the ground. It was a little shaky side to side, but it managed to balance itself out after a while, and I realized here by lowering it down onto the bottom, I could get even better results. This was the first time that I would pretty confidently say I managed to tame this engine, and with this, I might even be able to hover above the water. So I deleted off those bars that were holding me in place, and trying this out, it kind of just went right into the water here. So to fix that, I wanted to get some auto stabilization by lowering down this bottom custom shape. By doing this, it surprisingly seemed to make things even worse. So instead, I tried raising up the custom shape, and this also had some minor problems. It really seemed like what I had before might actually be the best that I can get here, and to get more stabilization, instead of moving around this weight, I wanted to add on a second engine. Now, I know I dismissed this before, that it was a little too chaotic, but since I'm using these larger engines, and with all this extra weight on here, it surprisingly seemed like these were pretty well in sync. And the advantage of bracing them together is that if one of them tries to rotate, it means the other one's gonna have to move up or down, which these things really don't want to do since there's so much mass on them. Now, that's definitely not to say that they can't move, but it makes it a lot harder for them to move around, and you can see after looking at these together now, I also wanted to add on some other weights to the outside here to further stabilize it. Now, with these here, I did get those perfectly linked in place, but for the first time, I managed to get on the water here, and while I tumbled over, it actually seemed to be on there for a reasonable amount of time. Now, I realized my buoys were kind of terrible, so I tried to use longer ones instead to see if maybe that would help things out a bit, but this also seemed to kind of just drag along the ground and not really do too well. Considering this worked so well though, I wanted to try separating these out even further and see if maybe this would give me even more stabilization. So once I moved the left engine even further left, I had to use some very long chains of steel to link these together. This was a little worrying because the steel isn't really that strong, and the amount of mass I have here was probably going to be enough to badly deform it. But now, once I finally got all the steel together, I wanted to try this out. Now, there was a little bit of bending here, but overall it did mostly manage to stay together, and I could see here it was at least trying not to flip too much. Now, to help this out a little bit, you can see I moved left all of the islands this is on, and after that, I used a couple of steel pieces to pin this in place so the engines could get up to speed. It really liked to flip over like this, but it was actually managing to not do a horrible job at staying floating, and to get it to glide on the water a bit easier, I used some more custom shapes, but these are a lot lighter than the ones above them. This makes them, for whatever reason, glide in the water a lot easier, and makes the whole floating mechanic a little more believable. So with the floating at least kind of sort of figured out, the next thing I needed to figure out was a way to move forward. I thought it'd be really cool to make a paddle that actually goes in the water and pushes me forward, so that's exactly what I wanted to make here. For this, I needed to make an attachment point in the middle of the boat, and I needed to build up another wheel. Now, this is actually really similar to making the other engines, but instead of using hydraulics to force the truck up against the side of the wheel, I just want to use steel to have a rigid attachment so it doesn't spin around randomly. This will let me extract useful power out of this wheel, and you can see now I'm using a 4-bar linkage to attach them further down to this other wheel. And next, I built up some long steel arms, and on the edges of those, I used some rods to work as my paddles. Trying this out in the air, it seemed to be working pretty well, and in the water, it also sort of seemed to be working. The problem though is that I never really seemed to be getting any useful power out of this, and it seemed to do a lot of weird things. In fact, sometimes it goes so fast that you can see here it's clearly pulling down the center of the boat, kind of working in the same way as the engines that I had before. So at this point, I figured my boat actually wasn't really too bad at the moment, and the way it moved forward, while it was kind of slow, at least seemed to go for a reasonable reasonable amount of time here, and that's more what I was concerned with. So with the basic mechanics pretty much done now, I wanted to add on the aesthetic stuff, and once again, this is for weight distribution reasons so that I wouldn't have to worry about tuning it later. So you can see I built up the very basic shape on the bottom with steel, and after that, I started to build up the mast here, and once I had that done, I used a custom shape to work as my sail. I really like using the custom shape here because it lets me get the whole thing white, which really makes it look a lot better against the steel. And with this, it started to float in the water pretty well here. And you can see here, once I got something that looked pretty good, I finally wanted to add on a dump truck to the back here and have this work as my cargo. Now, this was easy enough to get in place here with a couple of roads, and with this, I was able to slowly shimmy over to the right here and actually keep myself above the water. Now, one very important thing to note is this technically isn't self-stabilizing. What I've done is very carefully tuned everything on this boat to keep it above the water for as long as possible, but eventually it will always flip back or nosedive in the water. Now, I know that doesn't sound great, but it actually is okay because I'm able to have it stabilized for just long enough that by adding in some hydraulics to very carefully tune parts of this boat, I'm able to keep it above the water for practically as long as I want. This does make it kind of sensitive, which isn't exactly ideal, but the fact I'm able to get a boat to work at all in this game is honestly amazing. So guys, if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. If you have any future ideas for builds, make sure to leave those down in the comments below. Make sure to like the video if you like the build, and otherwise, till next time.